I'm Athena, the editor. And I want to start, Sasha, on a sort of basic level about this book. It has a really intuitive and dreamlike quality to it in its writing. It seems almost like it just kind of flowed naturally from you. Now, obviously, we know books don't just flow immediately and naturally out of someone, and it's a lot of work involved. But I am curious about if there was a moment, the first thing you ever wrote of this book, if it did sort of, spring out of you in that manner that it's sort of the writing suggests.
So I began as, and I went to grad school for poetry, but this book came out of two short stories that I'd written in probably 2009, that then around 2015, I started stitching together into a much longer story that was about 15 pages and very quickly turned out to be a lot stranger and weirder than I thought it was going to be. And it became very easy after that to begin to write something larger. What the larger thing was very hard to pin down for a very long time. I think it took me about 4 years to write half of it and 4 months to write the other half.
Well, can I ask what the original sort of thing was? I mean, was it an episode that you retained in the final novel we have here, or is it not
Much
even
of
in
it?
here anymore?
Much of it is still in the novel, but it hinged around, it was called Warren Beatty is a Sad, Sad Man. And Warren Beatty took on the role that the president kind of does throughout the novel. It ended up with the couple deciding to become bank robbers and use Warren Beatty to funnel the money they got from robbing banks. And then Warren Beatty would buy up all the debt owned by the banks and forgive it.
Okay, so to be clear, that isn't the present novel.
No.
There's some of that DNA in this one.
Yeah,
right?
when I would talk to people about it, people like when you go out to a bar and someone's like, "Oh, what are you working on?" I would tell them that. I'd be like, "Oh, a lot of stuff happens, and then at the end, this happens." And that would be. I decided that since that was the only thing I could really actually describe to anyone concretely, that it had to go. Mm-hmm. So that part now lives on as a movie that they watch and as something that happens in the video game that Sam plays about when the angels come.
Yeah. So to just clarify, the two main characters are called Sam and Eleanor. That's the sort of young couple or youngish couple. They're kind of in their 30s, right?
Yeah, they're in their early to mid 30s.
Yeah. I guess that's young. That's relatively young.
Yeah. That's what we're going to tell
our lives ahead of us. Yeah. So another question, sort of in the same vein, is that there's a lot of really earnest expressions of emotion and very earnest expressions of political beliefs in this book. And it strikes me as sort of like a tonic to a certain amount of numbness that has started to settle into the culture, especially after COVID, after the Trump years, after the sort of like maybe lack of full sort of realization of the promise of the George Floyd protests. I'm curious if this is something that you hope that this book achieves, is to sort of wake people up and help them through the sort of earnestness expressed, feel it themselves.
For me, I don't know really how else to write other than in a way of earnesty, in that it's just harder and harder to care about something, to see something through if you don't know how to really care about it on my end. As for what the book does, I have no idea. This is my first novel. It's my 4th book. I have no idea whether or not a book can do anything to a person. I know books have done things to and for me, and so I feel that I would like the things that I do to be able to help people through anything in the. Writing this book did, I think, help me better understand and reckon with the things around me. So ideally, it would be able to do that for at least one other person. And if it doesn't, maybe they like the jokes or they like the do-it-yourself dinner recipes. I tried to put something in there that could be of use to at least one other person.
Yeah. Well, that's that kind of takes me to my next topic I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk a little bit about the humor. First, I think I want to read like a passage that I think is especially funny or has one of my favorite jokes in the book in it. And I don't know if you have any idea which one I'm going for.
I have no idea what you're doing.
Let me start. No? Okay, here we go. After that, the president outlaws food stamps and Medicare and Medicaid. Being poor and being old is undignified. It's un-American. It is, quite frankly, unconstitutional. In response, 10 states legalized marijuana and put the highly taxed proceeds towards public education, statewide pre-K, single-payer healthcare, and fixing the goddamn MTA. I'm just kidding. Nobody does that. Italy's confused. France is run by Nazis. Meanwhile, Germany has gone full Bader Meinhof, and now everyone has to look up what that means. The internet is still touted as the Wild West, and that it remains unincorporated by the state, who could seize its titles at any moment. Christ's disciples hate the poor and love the banks, who now have voting rights and genders. All the banks are men now. You're welcome. The angels up in heaven were still packed in the bedroom with the door closed, flaming swords at the ready, wings singed, hearts full of nothing but light. Downstairs in their apartment are Sam and Eleanor. They don't know what to do. They get a little high and order a pizza. They consume cheese in a reckless fashion. It solves nothing, but they did have pizza. So I guess at least there's that. I really like the Bader Meinhof line. I think it's like, it's as if I had written that for some reason, because I do literally have to sort of Google it every time. But I wanted to bring up the humor and give a little bit of example of what I find to be funny in the voice and the tone of it, because it strikes me that humor requires this incredible like economy of language to work, to function. You know, it's like it has to either hit or not, you know, as a joke. You can't just sort of like plausibly be a little bit, I mean, I suppose you can, but then I wouldn't consider that really funny. And I think this book is laugh out loud, or at least sort of, you know, snort out loud as you read funny. And I just wanted to bring that up in light of your sort of past as a poet. I think poetry is also a thing where it has to be perfectly constructed and have this perfect economy to function and to succeed as a poem. So I'm wondering if you see sort of a connection between those two, or if that's, you know, that kind of makes any sense to you as a.
No, absolutely. I mean, part of the thing about I don't know necessarily about being a poet, but my approach to poetry, when you do a lot of readings, you end up doing a lot of readings in bars, and I don't really like using a microphone, at least in a small room. And so the louder you are and the more jokes you have, the funnier you can be, the easier it is for people to actually listen to what you're saying. And I believe that writers owe a reader something to hold their interest. I don't think a reader owes a writer their attention. And I think in terms of humor, for me, I've always been struck by the idea that a punchline is a thing that needs to make impact with you. And the first kind of a punch, like, yeah, like a joke should hurt a little in that it's a way to cope with the world around us. Like the world becomes stranger and crazier and harder to explain every day. It doesn't make sense that it keeps doing this.
Right.
Here we are.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what I like about that passage too. You know, it's like I guess the humor is a little bit bitter, but it's I don't know, it works for me. It speaks, you know, to the present moment in a way that seems true and helpful. So another thing that was in there was the angels, you know, with their singed wings and burning swords. There's a couple of religious elements in this book. There's also the protagonists are sort of exploring their Jewish identity throughout, you know, and incorporating Jewish ritual into their lives. But then there's also, you know, this sort of supernatural, mythological religious force that's sort of off stage throughout the book. And I'm just sort of curious, I mean, what you think about the interplay of spirituality and art, and sort of if that's always been sort of part of the themes you explore, or if this is sort of a book where you really, you know, incorporated that in a more intentional or explicit way than you have in the past, and what it sort of means to you to have the angels up in heaven, you know, off there waiting in the smallest apartment in heaven.
So part of this, I think maybe stems way back. Several years ago, Melissa Broder used to run these weird reading series where she would have like these themed readings, and one of them was the 7 deadly sins and the 7 heavenly virtues. And I got temperance, and I wrote about like the angel of temperance descending and just being like, knock it off, like just like cool it. This is a lot. We don't need to deal with this right now. And then like middle school children tear the angel apart. But angels are just this really interesting idea. Like I love Wings of Desire. I think it's such an incredible and beautiful movie. And there's so many concepts in it as to like what the purpose of an angel is. And the more you sort of read about it, like they don't make a whole lot of sense. And why we chose to represent them as like a person with wings when like celestial geometry is this thing that seems to be like, it burns your eyes out. Like you can't look at the face of God because your brain would explode. Like it just seemed like something that would open up a few more dimensions to the book and to the story, and having it also come out of this video game that Eleanor buys Sam, this sort of like Wings of Desire-esque video game. It began to be this way of like having reality bleed into irreality, having like media bleed into the world, having the world then bleed back into the media. There's a point in the game at which like Sam begins to realize that he can actually see his own life in it, and the people he knows, he has no idea why. I don't have any idea why. It seemed like a fun idea, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it got. But then also just, I mean, it's called Be Here to Love Me at the End of the World. If you're going to have the end of the world, that's when the angels come. So like that at its purest, I think, comes out of that. But then
Is
in
that
terms
like
of
a phrase that's been in your brain for a long time? You know, it's like, do you think that started being present in your mind as you worked on this book, or is that just, I don't know, just always been inside you?
that, on one hand, it's always been inside me. On the other hand, it definitely happened in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
they didn't start out in there. They just sort of gradually worked their way in. And then once they were there, it was really hard to imagine how to continue without finding a way to have them be a larger part of it, to have this sort of.
It's fun though when they're kind of a small part of it for a long time.
They're
Just, yeah,
really
they're there.
small, but it's really weird.
Yeah, yeah. As we talked about when we were working on the book together, you know, as like an editor, it's like a real question of how do you get the reader to understand this universe, you know, within the first few pages, right? It's like there's so much going on, and it gets so intense and wild so fast. But you know, it's like how do you introduce that? You know, I mean, that's just the classic. Like, I'm sure any writing workshop, that's basically what it's about. You know, when you're thinking about the first few sentences. But by the way, you know, the first few sentences are really effective. So,
You
I
really
mean,
come at you.
yeah, yeah. When did you get those? When did you nail those down? Because those have, I mean, never really changed, right? Since the final draft or the first final draft was complete.
So this book was, I wrote 2 full versions of it that had almost very little to do with the final book. Originally, it had this weird structure where like the first part was the story of Sam and Eleanor. There was this weird interruptive middle, and then there was a bit where 2 other people who were still Sam and Eleanor but weren't Sam and Eleanor went to a beach house in winter. And I never could get it to work. It had this weird elaborate like mid to late period David Lynch thing where like in Mulholland Drive, the story goes, and then there's that giant interruption.
Right,
The same
right.
people
And
are
Lost
different.
Highway did it the
And
same
yeah,
way.
and Lost Highway, Balthazar Getty all of a sudden like, and then Inland Empire, like Laura Dern starts screaming 3 hours into 6-hour movie, and then you're in Prague or something. Like,
yeah.
so I was like, oh, that's a great idea for a book. It's not. It's just not ready for a book. It's really hard. It's really dumb. And like you're just forced. So I just got rid of it, and I went back to the part that was really, really fun to write, which was Sam and Eleanor. Realizing that like seasons provide a really easy structure for any kind of narrative involving a couple, involving like a love story, and also a great way to just have like the world interrupt you all the time, the way the weather just keeps changing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, this book takes place basically over a year, and the seasons are very distinct. What do you mean by that? That it's a good way to talk about a couple? Is it sort of the basic pleasures of life and the basic struggles sort of arise naturally and flow with the seasons? Is that sort of?
Yeah, I think that when it's hot, we can both we're a little more excitable. Things can be it's easier to get cranky, it's easier to get happy, it's easier to feel frustrated. In the winter, it's even easier to feel frustrated when it's dark when it's like night at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which I think is in the first lines, as the sun sets at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, that's what it's like.
Yeah, but we're like, I feel that we're a part, like we are as defined by our environment as we are by our relationships. And just you, especially during COVID, you spend so much time like just staring out the window, working from home. You just watch the seasons change. So to ignore that seems silly. And it just, in a
Yeah.
plotless book, it's just a nice way to chart time or
It's not
plot.
flawless.
Well, like every single character has an arc. All kinds of things happen to them. They change and
Mhm.
grow, but like it's not like you can be like, oh, there was a
Right.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, like it is the plot of a life or a year,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
not there's not like a constructed plot.
Okay, I want to get to another symbol or leitmotif, perhaps. That the animals. There's a couple of very, effective and magical moments where an animal is featured. There's a great speckled bird that plays an interesting role. There's the wolves. There's dogs. Both the wolves and dogs at certain points are stacked on top of each other. And I'm really curious about that one specifically because I've always wondered if that was like an image you had in your head and you wrote about, or if it's more of a verbal sort of idea, that doesn't translate. I remember like when I used to study Gogol's like short stories and writing, that there was like this intense Russian theory about the fact that one actually couldn't physically imagine what was being explained on the page. For example, in the nose, that it's impossible to visualize,
Yeah.
but it exists as a physical thing in the story. And now I did have an illustrated version of the nose growing up where the nose just had a teensy tiny little body and it was very funny. But barring that, like the theory of that, I always thought was very interesting. And I'm just wondering sort of how that plays into these sort of surreal and sort of impossible things that you describe at certain points.
Some of them are a lot of them are images from a long time ago that I could never figure out what to do with. And at least the Great Speckled Bird comes from a lot of sort of country and folk, like just
Hmm.
there's a song about the Great Speckled Bird, like it's just the idea of things like descending or carrying us away. And
Mhm.
they become really easy symbols when there's something that at least in America have so much kind of mythology behind them in terms of like seeing them just in movies and the way they're rendered in all the murals that have been commissioned throughout the decades and centuries. It just seems like an easy way to have something else speak and act that's
Mhm.
outside of just the weather or
Mhm.
that isn't. I'm not really certain. I wish I had a better answer for this.
So what about
It
the
seems,
stacks of
it
wolves?
seems
Do you see
weird.
stacks of wolves in your head? Like that's
Yeah,
my
I
main
just saw a
question.
stack of wolves. I was just like
Yeah.
stacks on stacks of wolves, just one on top of the other. That seems terrifying.
Yeah.
Like deers
Scarier
walking
than a
around
wolf.
at that's frightening.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, obviously Sam and Eleanor are the core of the book, but there's a couple of other ancillary characters that are sort of, couples or couples that are breaking up or, some other ancillary love stories that have a more almost like mythological folkloric tinge to them. Are those things that again are from sort of that you found finally you could incorporate into this book, or is that really sort of something that grew naturally out of the thing that came to be here to love me at the end of the world?
One of the characters is not closely, but relatively based on things that have happened to a good friend of mine. But the rest of them are all people and things that have sort of organically come out of the story. Like
Yeah.
I needed to just have people in their lives. Most of them were wholly invented. One of them just gradually morphed into someone that I actually knew,
Mm-hmm.
who I then
Mm-hmm.
had to be like, oh my God, are you okay with like this is definitely like, are you fine with this? Is this okay? It
So
seems
you're not a
okay.
bad art friend. You're a good
No,
art
no,
friend.
I'm an art friend.
There we go.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to read another passage that I simply enjoy. Maybe kind of have a question related to it, but nothing too major. Okay. This one's a little longer. The plants in the apartment were, for the record, as follows. Muppet Baby, whose leaves were like fingers the color of fresh grass, and who was not currently, but would soon be dying. Franklin Pierce, who was spiky and dark, and whose wife suffered from depression, and whose children all died in childhood, every one of them, and who opposed the abolitionist movement, and unlike its namesake, this plant was not and would possibly never be dying. Mr. President, a small jade plant who was thriving and stubborn for most of this narrative, right up until the end, Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of the radio, a real large plant with leaves like a tree made of vines, and it was strung with lights and stayed low to the ground by the two low-slung yellow chairs in the living room. Several unnamed supporting actors of various sizes and dimensions, all of them in relatively small pots, some with tall stalks reaching to the sky, others low and cranky and threatening death, plotting their cruelties by kitchen windows. Evidence of alien life, who started as what looked like an angry pine cone. Then one day, 3 tendrils emerged, and the tendrils overnight or over time unfurled into hard, bright blossoms. And then they kept growing, curling ever upward towards the ceiling, where they made their way to the window, their motives and origins unknown to this very day. The first lady, who was beautiful and died that way too, Big Boy, a truly enormous elephant ear plant whose roots threatened the confines of her brass bucket. Warren Beatty, ooh, a moonshine snake. The rite of spring, a bird's nest fern Sam has absolutely managed to help thrive by watering lightly around the edges and misting periodically. General Gorgeous, a burgundy and gold croton who cannot decide if they want to live or die. The economy, a thriving and a bit too on the nose named money plant. Nope, an enormous yellow and green snake plant kept on the floor of the bedroom, at least 4 feet tall and thriving. A peperomia ginny named Opening Day, full of hope and promise, and 3 hanging plants named the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. And of course, the rubber tree plant, last seen slowly divesting itself of its worldly possessions, now no longer even discreetly waiting for the end to come, but racing towards it head first, like oblivion was a destination you arrive at on your own. Are those your plants? Be honest.
Here's Warren Beatty.
Warren Beatty. Any more celebrity appearances that can could be made
here? Here's the economy.
The economy, a bit too on the nose.
It won't die, but I wouldn't say it's thriving, but it's not. It won't. It refuses to die.
So those are the best. I mean, I wish I had a deeper question relating to that passage.
No, those are either plants that I have or have had. I had this horrible tragedy of like getting some soil that was infested with fungus flies, and I lost like 4 plants, and nothing I did could save them. And it broke my heart. Yeah. Now I gotta buy new plants.
They've got names.
Got names.
What about the rubber tree plant though? Is that a real plant?
Oh God, my old roommate and I had
asked like because
3 rubber tree plants. Yes. We had like 3 rubber tree plants, and they kept dying. They died every single time. I finally have one that I'm keeping alive, and like I don't want to get up and show it to anyone. I don't want anyone to see it. Like I want to wait like a year or 2. Like I have no idea if it's gonna live.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. To tie things up, don't say anything, but the final moment affects me very strongly, the end of the book. And it turns out like it's kind of been pointed out to me recently that I really react strongly to people who really stick the ending. You know, I think that's like incredibly important. I love like Antonioni movies, you know, or he just like always just like blows you out of the water in the last 5 minutes, you know, no matter what you thought of the movie beforehand. And I think recently Sheila Heti's book Motherhood was, you know, just like one of those like soul shaking final lines. I think you have a soul shaking final line too. And I guess if you're able to talk about this without indicating, you know, too much, I mean, not to say it's like a big spoiler, but I just think the emotional impact is greater if you're reading the book and mount to it. You know, and speaking of sort of, is it plotless? Does it move anywhere? I think, well, it moves towards this moment. So it gets from point A to point B, and it gets you there through every single thing that happens in this book. But when did you know, how did that feel? Did it, again, I'm curious about that sort of fundamental question. Did it just sort of come to you, you know, just, you know, and when in the process did you sort of know?
I don't know if you remember, and I'm sure absolutely no one else knows this, but you had emailed me the day that I finished drafting this book, and it didn't have the ending that it has. I had always wanted to write that ending, but I just couldn't figure it out. And all of a sudden, it came to me whole, and I just wrote it down.
That's like the first question I asked, I guess, which I'm glad we've done sort of a full circle, is like the number of things that came to you whole and the numbers that did it, because it's so interesting. It's this book has come to you in so many different parts, and it has a slightly sort of eclectic or collected feel, as we've been pointing out. There's a lot of different elements. There's the funny things and the history lessons, which you didn't even talk about. I apologize. Although to some extent, I think maybe the passage I was reading had a little bit of that flavor to it. You know, there's the just taxonomies and the daily life and the recipes and all of that, you know. So it's like you get a sense that, you know, a lot of them came naturally, but obviously so much work had to happen to bring it together into what is a singular and single, you know, book. But I'm relieved to hear at least one thing is it had that characteristic of where you're just sort of, you know, birthing it into the world to just make it as corny as possible.
No, I would say that about roughly like half the book came to me almost whole, and the other half was me trying to make sure that the rest of it could all lead there. And I think part of the difficulty with the process of a book like this is that when you have a more linear plot, you have an easy way of being like, well, this has to happen, then this has to happen, then this has to happen, then. And with a book like this, the concern is always like, I got to stick the landing. So when something new happens, you got to go all the way back and make sure that like everything leading up to that makes sense, so that everything can just stick the landing.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're of the same mind about sticking the landing.
You gotta stick the landing. That's the whole point.
You gotta.
It's gotta end.
Exactly. So as we've established in this talk, we stick the beginning and the ending in this book. So in that respect, and hopefully in this talk as well.